Oh, how many, many times in that long ride did Dolly think of her old lover, poor fond, slighted Joe! How many, many times did she recall that night when she ran into his arms from the very man now projecting his hateful gaze into the darkness where she sat, and leering through the glass in monstrous admiration. And when she thought of Joe, and what a brave fellow he was, and how he would have rode boldly up and dashed in among these villains now, yes, though they were double the number, and here she clenched her little hand and pressed her foot upon the ground, the pride she felt for a moment in having won his heart faded in a burst of tears, and she sobbed more bitterly than ever. As the night wore on, and they proceeded by ways which were quite unknown to them, for they could recognize none of the objects of which they sometimes caught a hurried glimpse, their fears increased, nor were they without good foundation. It was not difficult for two beautiful young women to find, in their being borne they knew not whither by a band of daring villains who eyed them, as some among these fellows did, reasons for the worst alarm. When they at last entered London, by a suburb with which they were wholly unacquainted, it was past midnight, and the streets were dark and empty. Nor was this the worst, for the carriage stopping in a lonely spot, Hugh suddenly opened the door, jumped in, and took his seat between them. It was in vain they cried for help. He put his arm about the neck of each, and swore to stifle them with kisses if they were not as silent as the grave. "I come here to keep you quiet," he said, "and that's the means I shall take. So don't be quiet, pretty mistresses. Make a noise, do, and I shall like it all the better." They were proceeding at a rapid pace, and apparently with fewer attendants than before, though it was so dark, the torches being extinguished, that this was mere conjecture. They shrunk from his touch, each into the farthest corner of the carriage, but shrink as Dolly would, his arm encircled her waist and held her fast. She neither cried nor spoke, for terror and disgust deprived her of the power, but she plucked at his hand as though she would die in the effort to disengage herself, and crouching on the ground, with her head averted and held down, repelled him with a strength she wondered at as much as he. The carriage stopped again. "Lift this one out," said Hugh to the man who opened the door, as he took Miss Haredale's hand, and felt how heavily it fell. "She's fainted." "So much the better," growled Dennis. It was that amiable gentleman. "She's quiet. I always like 'em to faint, unless they're very tender and composed." "Can you take her by yourself?" asked Hugh. "I don't know till I try. I ought to be able to. I've lifted up a good many in my time," said the hangman. "Up, then. She's no small weight, brother. None of these here fine gals are. Up again. Now we have her." Having by this time hoisted the young lady into his arms, he staggered off with his burden. "Look ye, pretty bird," said Hugh, drawing Dolly towards him, "remember what I told you. A kiss for every cry. Scream, if you love me, darling. Scream once, mistress. Pretty mistress, only once, if you love me." Thrusting his face away with all her force, and holding down her head, Dolly submitted to be carried out of the chaise and borne after Miss Haredale into a miserable cottage, where Hugh, after hugging her to his breast, set her gently down upon the floor. Poor Dolly! Do what she would, she only looked the better for it, and tempted them the more. When her eyes flashed angrily, and her ripe lips slightly parted to give her rapid breathing vent, who could resist it? When she wept and sobbed as though her heart would break, and bemoaned her miseries in the sweetest voice that ever fell upon a listener's ear, who could be insensible to the little winning pettishness which now and then displayed itself, even in the sincerity and earnestness of her grief? When forgetful for a moment of herself, as she was now, she fell on her knees beside her friend, and bent over her, and laid her cheek to hers, and put her arms about her, what mortal eyes could have avoided wandering to the delicate bodice, the streaming hair, the neglected dress, the perfect abandonment and unconsciousness of the blooming little beauty? Who could look on and see her lavish caresses and endearments, and not desire to be in Emma Haredale's place, to be either her or Dolly, either the hugging or the hugged? Not Hugh, not Dennis. "I tell you what it is, young women," said Mr. Dennis, "I ain't much of a ladies' man myself, nor am I a party in the present business further than lending a willing hand to my friends. But if I see much more of this here sort of thing, I shall become a principal instead of a accessory, I tell you candid." "Why have you brought us here?" said Emma. "Are we to be murdered?" "Murdered!" cried Dennis, sitting down upon a stool and regarding her with great favour. Why, my dear, who'd murder such chickabiddies as you? If you was to ask me now whether you was brought here to be married, there might be something in it." And here he exchanged a grin with Hugh, who removed his eyes from Dolly for the purpose. "No, no," said Dennis, "there'll be no murdering, my pets. Nothing of that sort. Quite the contrary." "You are an older man than your companion, sir," said Emma, trembling. "Have you no pity for us? Do you not consider that we are women?" "I do indeed, my dear," retorted Dennis. "It would be very hard not to, with two such specimens afore my eyes. Ha ha! Oh yes, I consider that. We all consider that, miss." He shook his head waggishly, leered at Hugh again, and laughed very much as if he had said a noble thing and rather thought he was coming out. "There'll be no murdering, my dear, not a bit in it. I tell you what, though, brother," said Dennis, cocking his hat for the convenience of scratching his head, and looking gravely at Hugh, "it's worthy of notice, as a proof of the amazing equalness and dignity of our law, that it don't make no distinction between men and women. I've heard the judge say sometimes to a highwayman or housebreaker as had tied the ladies neck and heels—you'll excuse me making mention of it, my darlings—and put 'em in a cellar, that he showed no consideration to women. Now I say that there judge didn't know his business, brother, and that if I had been that there highwayman or housebreaker I should have made answer, 'What are you a-talking of, my lord? I showed the women as much consideration as the law does, and what more would you have me do?' If you was to count up in the newspapers the number of females as have been worked off in this here city alone in the last 10 year," said Mr. Dennis thoughtfully, "you'd be surprised at the total, quite amazed, you would. There's a dignified and equal thing, a beautiful thing, but we've no security for its lasting, now that they've begun to favour these here papists. I shouldn't wonder if they went and altered even that one of these days. Upon my soul I shouldn't." The subject, perhaps from being of too exclusive and professional a nature, failed to interest Hugh as much as his friend had anticipated, but he had no time to pursue it, for at this crisis Mr. Tappertit entered precipitately, at sight of whom Dolly uttered a scream of joy and fairly threw herself into his arms. "I knew it! I was sure of it!" cried Dolly. "My dear father's at the door. Thank God! Thank God! Bless you, Sim! Heaven bless you for this!" Simon Tappertit, who had at first implicitly believed that the locksmith's daughter, unable any longer to suppress her secret passion for himself, was about to give it full vent in its intensity, and to declare that she was his for ever, looked extremely foolish when she said these words, the more so as they were received by Hugh and Dennis with a loud laugh which made her draw back and regard him with a fixed and earnest look. "Miss Haredale," said Sim, after a very awkward silence, "I hope you're as comfortable as circumstances will permit of. Dolly Varden, my darling, my own, my lovely one, I hope you're pretty comfortable likewise." Poor little Dolly! She saw how it was, hid her face in her hands, and sobbed more bitterly than ever. "You meet in me, Miss V.," said Simon, laying his hand upon his breast, "not a 'prentice, not a workman, not a slave, not the victim of your father's tyrannical behaviour, but the leader of a great people, the captain of a noble band, in which these gentlemen are, as I may say, corporals and sergeants. You behold in me not a private individual, but a public character; not a mender of locks, but a healer of the wounds of his unhappy country. Dolly V., sweet Dolly V., for how many years have I looked forward to this present meeting! For how many years has it been my intention to exalt and ennoble you! I redeem it. Behold in me your husband. Yes, beautiful Dolly, charmer, enslaver, S. Tappertit is all your own." As he said these words he advanced towards her. Dolly retreated till she could go no farther, and then sank down upon the floor. Thinking it very possible that this might be maiden modesty, Simon essayed to raise her, on which Dolly, goaded to desperation, wound her hands in his hair, and crying out amidst her tears that he was a dreadful little wretch and always had been, shook and pulled and beat him until he was fain to call for help most lustily. Hugh had never admired her half so much as at that moment. "She's in an excited state to-night," said Simon, as he smoothed his rumpled feathers, "and don't know when she's well off. Let her be by herself till to-morrow, and that'll bring her down a little. Carry her into the next house." Hugh had her in his arms directly. It might be that Mr. Tappertit's heart was really softened by her distress, or it might be that he felt it in some degree indecorous that his intended bride should be struggling in the grasp of another man. He commanded him, on second thoughts, to put her down again, and looked moodily on as she flew to Miss Haredale's side, and clinging to her